designed by Mies van der. They would have no view whatsoever. By doing a triangular hotel, they can look out beyond, they get a view, and the developer also gets a distinctive building, so it stands out very nicely. So I often point out that if you're an architect who's not doing run-of-the-mill what everybody else is doing, you better be very convincing and a good reason why you want to do something different, so the developer understands that there's a reason for it. Now that's from 2000 and, probably maybe 5 or 6, early on in the 2000s. Directly behind me is a very tall silver building with a mast coming off its top. That building is the second tallest building in Chicago. To the top of the mast, 1,390 feet tall. It's the Trump International Hotel and Tower. Architect Adrian Smith. It's from 2009. It's a combination of condominium apartments over condominium hotel. So in this building, you can own your own apartment or your own hotel suite. Now, it's a very tall building, third tallest in Chicago. Very dramatic. Now, the fun thing is, this is not the building originally planned for this site or approved by Chicago. What should be standing here is an office building roughly twice the height of this building. It was going to be the prestige office building in the entire world, tallest office building in the world when it opened up in the late 2000s. They were marketing the building even before they broke ground for the foundation. They were all set to go. They had leased out the majority of the unbuilt building, and then one day the switchboard at Trump Tower lit up and everyone wanted out of their leases because the planes were flying into the World Trade Center. Nobody wanted to be the next terrorist target. So two decisions were made. Number one, drop the height by more than a foot. Don't even be tallest in Chicago. And number two, go residential. Don't be an office space anymore. Now, back to our left very quickly. Mies van der Rohe to our immediate left. And next to Mies, we have an Art Deco building. This is from that Deco era. This is about 1929, 1930. It's by Halliburton Group. It's a tall, narrow, vertical building. But notice the way Halliburton Group take the 3 center windows in the wall facing the river and put dark panels between the floors. Why do they have them there? When you see it from any distance, you do not see window, floor, floor. You see the windows running vertical lines. So we're accentuating the vertical. This next building's about 1923. Alfred Alschuler built an office building for an insurance company. And what does he do? He does the Beaux-Arts look. An ancient Greek temple up top. Corinthian columns, the canvas sleeves, urns. Everything about this is ancient Greece. But that's the way your building looked impressive and important. The two buildings share one thing in common. They're made of limestone. It's expensive to carve limestone. So the ornamentation is rather limited on the building. If you really want to go whole hog, there were other options. Coming up here to our left, a building with a domed tower and the little temples in its corners. That's from about 1924-25. It's by Javert Nickelberg's Steel Barn, Fruit Barn. It was the jeweler's building. In this building, utilizing ancient Roman detailing. It's done in terracotta. Terracotta is tile. You want to have ornamentation? Make one mold, keep stamping out copies. You can do all sorts of detail all over your building. And it becomes a very vivid, very active building in terms of detailing. It's fun. Next to it, the white building is an early 1960s building designed by an architect from Chicago, Al Shaw, but Shaw is copying the look of New York back in that era, the monolith stone look. This was the response to the Miesian look. Let's do stone and get windows in the stone. Now I would normally stay to our left, but we'll look at everyone in a minute. So I'll swing to our right so we can talk about what everyone's going to look at. First we got Mies, again. Window panes and window frames. Mies, by the way, was a great architect and a great teacher. But as we all know, sometimes students don't pay attention in class. The next two buildings are by Bertrand Goldberg, who studied under Mies van der Rohe. And clearly Bertrand either skipped or slept through the class on rectangles. His basic belief was that there was no such thing as a right angle or a straight line in nature. His goal was to create organic forms utilizing circles and curves. He completes the towers of Marina City about 1962 and declares he has just done 2 trees to tower along the banks of the Chicago River. Try as we might, Chicagoans never saw trees in the buildings, but we did see organic form, and we named nicknamed them the corn cobs. Now, I don't recall them trees or corn cobs. I got to call them one other thing as well. They're the icons of Chicago. During the roughly 60 years they had stood, pretty much every single movie or television program shooting any footage in Chicago and wanting to establish a contemporary Chicago setting will always show you at least one shot of these buildings. They are the go-to Chicago buildings. Now, one series filmed here, 6 full seasons, never once showed Marina City. It was a series on Fox called Empire. Contemporary setting, never showed Marina City, and the basic reason they didn't was that while Empire was filmed in Chicago, it was set in New York. That was our way to Chicago. Now back to our left, this nasty little concrete building. This is an offshoot from the early 1960s. It's a brutalist building. Brutalist was all about poured concrete. And brutalist buildings, not especially attractive, short-lived style. Not used very often for commercial buildings. Where do you find most of the brutalism? On university campuses. They loved it. It was cheap. And then the next door neighbor by Ricardo Bofill, Spaniard doing Greek. But coming up beyond this next bridge, we have 2 buildings side by side but decades apart. The first one, this last one, is by Handel Associates, opened about 3-4 years ago.
Like the Twin Towers.
If you look carefully, really carefully, you can see the concrete floors inside. The wall tells you nothing. This is contemporary, just the abstraction of the wall going up. Next door neighbor,
That's
Art
what they're
Deco.
talking about.
And again, it's Halliburton Roof, about 1930. We have the dark panels for the center windows. That was one of their trademarks. They're giving you that vertical look. They've even broken up into vertical elements to accentuate all the verticality. So it's a great way of being able to see the building and seeing all that verticality. Deco was a great style for its time. And had the Great Depression not settled in, which stopped all construction, it would have probably gone on for decades. But once it was on, it was pretty much on. But the interesting thing is, it has had resurrections and revivals over the years. Coming up on our left, you see a gray building with some rather odd ornamentation on top. I would say it reminds me of the Flash Forward movies. This is a 1988 building by an architect named Bill Pedersen. And Pedersen here is giving us his postmodern interpretation of Art Deco. As we get to the front of the building, I want you to look at the windows and the way he plays with them. There are 14 windows across the front. There are 2 piers of granite at either side. And each pier there are 4 windows across, in pairs. So we've got 2 sets of pairs running up the building, so we've got those vertical lines. The middle section, recessed slightly, has 6 windows in triplets until you get to the very top. And then suddenly you're looking at this big splash of glass running across, now division with an arch over it. If you're wondering what that's all about, that is Bill Pedersen doing something called contextualism. He is letting you know he's acknowledging his site. He is picturing a river with a bridge. Why is he doing it? The bridge over the river right behind me. So he's citing his building, saying, this is where I am, and I'm recognizing it in my building. Now, Pedersen really gets into his contextualism in the next building, his green glass building coming up, the New Bean building. It's from 1983. In this building, he takes his cue from the site in a number of ways. Cue number 1, the river turns here. What does he do? A great sweeping convex curved wall. He plays with the turn of the river. Cue number 2, he looks at the water of the river. We have a green river. It's not sunny right now, but on a sunny day, you see light green in the sunlight, darker green in the shade. What's the building? Light and dark green glass for the sunlit and shaded water. And the base of the building, strong horizontal bands of granite and marble with portholes, his interpretation of the riverbed and train tunnels passing over the river. He does the entire river there. You do that, you cannot be ignored. And 15 years later, DeStefano and Associates from Chicago gets the commission to do that gray building over to your right-hand side. Look at the concave curved wall. They become Pedersen's dance partner. And then this next one goes up in 2017. This is by Picard Children. A convex curved wall like Bill Pedersen. Portholes like Bill Pedersen. Great Lakes building. You see around there?
1910.
That is on what was a loading dock. It was a common offload cargo into the base of the building. It was warehouse space down below. It was office space up above. The idea of seeing lights like that seems shocking now. That was up and down the river well into the 1940s. The next building up beyond this bridge is another new one just opened up last year. It's the Bank of America building by Jim Getch. Getch here plays a little game with you. Sometimes you don't want to utilize the full footprint of your property. It has zoning issues there. So what does Getch do? He stops the building probably about 15, 20 feet short of the edge of the property at its base, but he got up 6 stories and suddenly he projects out cantilevering. Notice, by the way, all the little right angles. He is thinking American corporate mentality. What's this office everyone wants when they're working in the company? The corner one. This one has 8 corner offices on one side. Lots of
It's all
opportunity
tinted.
there. Our next building, 1928 Art Deco, our Opera House, which seems like an awfully strange building for an opera house. Let me break it down for you. This limestone wall is the side wall of the theater. The theater is 8 stories high, contains more than 3,500 seats. It's like a large opera house in the entire world. The developer Sam also loved opera, but instantly that opera was very expensive, so he decided to build the opera house and wrap an office building around it. His theory being that directly the offices was subsidized the art of the opera. So we have the theater with the offices wrapped around the side. It was a wonderful idea. The only problem was the first head of the theater, Civic Opera Company, moved in, gave their first performance 7 days after the market crash in 1929. Soon there were no tenants in the offices and there was no opera company. Right now, Lyric Opera Chicago is in there. They've been there since 1954 and they love their space. Building here to our left, Chicago and Johnson's CME Group building or the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Center. You see again corner offices, lots of them. Each floor has 16 corner offices. And there are 2 towers, which means each level has 32. I always say this building has more satisfied ego than any of those in Chicago. You've got lots and lots of wonderful office spaces. To our left, a building from the early 1960s by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. An exoskeleton of granite and concrete outside the walls of the building. Why? Because that's what they wanted to do. There's no functional reason for them being there. It's just there. We come back 10 years later, things have changed. We're doing different styles. Here, dark green granite, highly polished, dark tinted windows. On a sunny day, very elegant, very formal, very businesslike. At night, Darth Vader. Incredibly dark and very menacing. And that's the real business. So 2 buildings, same architectural firm, 10 years apart, but the style had changed. Building here to our left, Harry Weiss, who liked to triangle. I mentioned him earlier. In this building, it looks like he's doing a rectangle. Actually, not quite so much. If you saw it from above or from a distance, you would see that it's actually 2 right-angle triangles that are 6 stories different at height that form a rectangular form at the base. And in order to get this triangle on a real angle, you get into a lobby, you do not have a rectangular lobby. You have always to go from corner to corner, cutting the bottom several stories into right-angle triangles. So we've got all this triangular form in one. Building here to our left meets Vandero's style, kind of. AFC Interstellar is a building opposite a noisy train station. They put all the mechanicals back here. Big old nasty section of concrete till the Ocean Society live things up and commission a mural. Tan splashes the river. The horizontal vertical lines are city streets in the red box. About 2/3 of the way up. This is the building itself. It's sort of the "You Are Here" sign for Chicago. It's a way of taking a really uninteresting portion of the building and making it the top of the town for a while. Now the next one we're going to talk about is coming just the other way. And we're not talking office buildings anymore. It's an apartment building. It's a 2009, it's a 235 BPM, architect Ralph Johnson. All the boxes and balconies, we love balconies in Chicago. I honestly have no idea why we can't use 8 months of the year. We still case, he decides to not give you the typical balcony over balcony over balcony. He uses three different sizes of balconies and staggers them. Creates a rhythmic effect on the building. Now, you might wonder what's happening with all of a sudden all of downtown Hamden area right? And as we look over here to our left, we see newer residential buildings, and the older buildings are all old factories or warehouses. An industrial section of town. You may wonder, well, why did that happen all of a sudden? What happened was the river, but not as we know it now. Up until the late 1920s, at about this point, Ramel would have taken a sharp turn to the left and head us about 3 blocks off to the east. Then we take a sharp turn to the right, start heading south, and on a meandering river, and then eventually about a mile or two further down, we'd make another right turn. The river twisted and turned, and rivers were considered barriers for development. So nobody wanted to be on the wrong side of the river. Well, Chicago wanted a bigger downtown area. They also wanted a river that was good for navigation. So in the early 1920s, the city of Chicago approached the 14 railroads that owned this property that we're floating on now. They said, we want you to pull up your tracks. We want to cut a wide, straight channel for the river. When we are done cutting this in, we'll fill in the old channel over there. You will get land, we will have water, we will all be happy. The only people really happy with the entire thing were the lawyers involved in the lawsuits, which went on for years. But in 1928, we finished cutting in this wide, straight channel. In 29, they finished filling in that over there, and they thought the railroad would have the property, they'll continue downtown. 1929, the market crashes. No one needs office space anymore, so what do? Warehouses and factories. When those weren't required, some got knocked down, the rest of them get converted into apartments. This land right here was railroad property. Vacated in the 1970s. Starting in 2015, we've had some buildings pop up. But back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Edward had a dream of doing something different. He bought all the land for the last bridge to the next one. Commissions Bertrand Goldberg to do a plan for a residential complex. And the developer says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build phase 1 of the project. When it fills up, I'll then continue the project. Phase 1 is completed in 1985. Everyone looks at it and says, what a wonderful building by Bertrand Goldberg. Nobody wants to live here. Nobody wants to come down here. The project died instant. That's 1/4 of what should have been here. Imagine, if you will, an apartment building that would have been a mile long, sweeping and turning and curving. It would have had more than 4,000 apartments. Down below, all that glassed-in space, stores, offices, schools, theaters, a library, maybe a house of worship or two. The idea of River City was to have a totally self-contained city within the city. It was ahead of its time. We saw the development just to the north of it. This land here should have also been River City. There are owners who bought this. They're planning something eventually, coming a little bit late. But I often point out, it's sometimes a dream that might start in the 1970s or 80s, doesn't get completed right away. It might take to the 2020s to make it happen. So you end up with 40, 50 years later before things actually begin working out. Now, empty land can come in various ways. Many times when you see empty land in a city, you see sections where buildings were torn down. That's when we get them. In Chicago, that happened as well sometimes, but a lot of what happened was railroad property. Railroads were a huge presence in Chicago. And starting in the 1960s, when they didn't need as much space, they began consolidating. Railroads began going away, land became available. So we had development. That was all railroad right away until the 1970s. And then coming up beyond this next bridge, you're going to see a huge section of land. That's 63 vacant acres. It was a railroad switching area. Railroads empty it. It's purchased by investors. They built some townhouses. Off on the far edge, if you go just above the tree line, you can see brick buildings. Those are townhouses that are part of this complex, right by a street. The rest of the land, they were waiting. They wanted to wait for the magic moment to make a killing on their investment. They did nothing. We went for decades with weeds and trees growing here. It's disgusting. And then about maybe 8-9 years ago, maybe a little earlier, our mayor at the time, Raul Emanuel, told the owners of the
Ese video
property,
no está
provided,
descargado.
okay, here's the deal.
Esa viene de
You
marca,
develop your
viene de
property in
marca.
Chicago, take it over through eminent domain in full development.
Pero y
Instantly,
el presidente
the owners brought in Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill, major architectural
dice que van
firm,
agarrando el vaso.
master plan to develop this site. 63 acres.
No, a lo mejor si lo hacen va a tener mucho,
Their
va a
plan
tomar
calls
muchos
for a river walk by the river with restaurants and bars behind it, townhouses, high-rise apartment buildings, and retail buildings, office buildings, probably a bit school or two, and a park that would actually follow the path of where the river used to be over in that land. So you'd be able to see the footprint of the park itself. And that was the original plan. And then all of a sudden, Amazon's talking about wanting to put a second headquarters somewhere in America. Our city was in the bidding in a couple of sites, this being one of them. We actually held in there until the very last round when they decided, no, we're going to go to D.C. and do something there. So that fell through. And then more recently, developers had plans to, let's put the new Chicago casino on that site. That fell through. So eventually we'll be seeing something happening here. So we've stumbled along for a number of years, and eventually we'll be seeing. So I'm convinced I won't live to see this thing built. I'm getting too old for it, but it'll be kind of fun to see when it finally does happen, as this will all fill in. And again, it was never developed as anything other than railroad property. Now you may wonder where we're going. I promised you an architectural tour. There aren't really any buildings around here unless you look off to the side there. Well, Ramel is giving me an indulgence. I look at a boat full of people and I keep looking, going, many of you may be in Chicago for the first time. You may be staying in a downtown or a near North Side hotel, great areas to stay. And you can go out around your hotel, see where the restaurants are, if there are any stores around there. You visit that section. You go over to the lakefront to see our skyline and shoreline. You go to Millennium Park, you have to do that. Everyone must do that in Chicago. You might go to a museum. We've got great ones in Chicago. And then hopefully you'll find your way to Michigan and spend lots of money. But then you're going to go home and tell all your friends and family you've seen Chicago. No, you haven't. We are a city of 2.7 million people. Very few of us live in downtown Chicago or the near North Side. Many of us don't even work in downtown Chicago or the near North Side. We live and work in the neighborhoods of Chicago. And one feature of our neighborhoods, they're ethnic. We are a very ethnic city. My one joke has always been, you name me any nationality, I can give you at least one neighborhood they built and or still occupy in Chicago. I got stumped last year by one person who hit me with Hawaiian. My only logical response was, why would they move here? But everything else is here. Greektown, Little Italy. We have an Indian and Pakistani neighborhood. We have Korean neighborhoods. We have Swedish. We have German. We have Vietnamese. Everything is here throughout the city of Chicago. One of our neighborhoods, Pilsen, was built by Bohemians. It's now a major Mexican-American neighborhood. And here to our left, we have our Chinatown. Many of you may come from the city with Chinatowns. The typical response to a Chinatown is, we know all about, it's the place you go to eat Chinese food and buy knockoff designer stuff. Not in Chicago. Ours is unique amongst the Chinatowns in this country. It is the only American Chinatown that is actually growing as an ethnic Chinese neighborhood. New York and San Francisco are both larger, but they're becoming more ethnically diverse. They're gentrifying. Ours is becoming more Chinese. You come to Chinatown, Chicago, if you are there early enough, you will not hear English anywhere. You may be the only English-speaking person in the entire place. It's all the Ghana, China, and all the cuisines. Now, for those of your Chicago friends and family, to give you a weapon, that pavilion. Later on today, call your friends and family and say that while you were on your cruise, you saw Pingtown Memorial Park and the Chinese Pavilion on the river. And I say I'm giving you a weapon with that because that's been there for more than 20 years. Most Chicagoans have never seen it, and many have no idea it even exists. It is so little known, in fact, that a couple of years ago, the television program The Amazing Race sends contestants around the world to find sites and cities where they don't speak the language, finished their season in Chicago with a challenge to find that pavilion, and they almost couldn't do it. They couldn't find cab drivers who knew where the park was. Another thing your friends won't know is the bridge over there. That bridge has been here since 1905. It's a railroad lift bridge. It's the
Dang.
only one of its kind on the Chicago River. You may
That's
think,
more
okay, it's obviously a low bridge. That must be the only one that opens up to the passage of boats. That's not the case. Every bridge we have passed under on this cruise opens up for the passage of boats. It's the
117
one-off in
years
terms of
ago.
design. I think it doesn't get replicated for a couple of reasons. Reason number one,
That's
the lift takes
117 years
forever.
old.
5 minutes up, and it hangs there while a boat or a barge underneath. 5 minutes down. Every time they open the bridge, it's tied up traffic for 15 to 20 minutes. They can do it here time between trains. Cannot time Michigan Avenue. Reason number two, a lot of energy expended opening and closing the bridge. And number three, it's ugly. You didn't want ugly bridges, took a lot of energy, and were slow moving. We wanted fast, free, and efficient like this. This is a truncated bascule bridge. It opens from your right to left, one single sweeping motion, a very simple bit of motion. And it's a bit of mechanical engineering in which you take two totally unequal weights, find a balancing point between them, put an axle under it, and let gravity do all the work for you. The bridges coming up behind me now show you in skeletal form how they work. Over to the left, you see a huge block of concrete. That is the counterweight to the span of the bridge.
Oh my
It weighs
goodness,
about 2.5 times what the span does. There's an axle in between the two of them. When the bridge is being used, it opens up in about a minute, drops in about a minute, and because you're letting gravity do all the work for you, all you do is one quick tweak of an engine, and it just takes off by itself. So it opens up very quickly, closes very quickly. It's efficient, energy-wise, but it's not a huge towering thing. Now you may go, well, what's with the holes in the concrete? They are there in case anyone decides to make the bridge pretty. We don't think about this very often, but when you paint things, you add weight to them. And back around 30, 40 years ago, Chicago totally forgot that concept. We went on a kick of painting all our bridges. They were wonderful, looked beautiful. And then when the first boating season came up, they had a hard time opening them. Engines were struggling. And everyone's walking around going, well, they're old bridges. They date the 1920s. Clearly the problem is the engines are failing. We have to get new engines for the bridges. And then finally someone said, no, dummies, you painted the bridges and broke the balance. So they had to go out and sandblast all the bridges down to base metal. Then they put on just enough paint to get the balance back in place. This one's all set. You want to paint me? Stick more concrete in the holes. You can change the balance that way. Now, I had promised you buildings. I can talk about one now, a big tall black thing back behind me with the two antennas on its roof. That's the Willis Tower. Completed in 1974, designed by Bruce Graham and Fosler Rahman Khan. They were an architect and a structural engineer for the firm of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Willis Tower is a 110-story office building. To its roof line, it is 1,451 feet tall. When it opened in 1974, it was not called the Willis Tower. Back then it was called the Sears Tower. The name changed officially on July 1st, 2009. And I stress the word officially when I say that. If you ask any long-time Chicago what that building is called, 9 out of 10 of the day we die are going to tell you Sears Tower. Also in 1974 it was called something else, the tallest building in the world. Held that title from 1974 until 1997. No matter how you measured a building, this was the tall one. And then in 1997, two buildings went up in Kuala Lumpur. Petronas Towers 1 and 2 by Cesar Pena. And upon their completion, the Council on Tall Buildings declared them to be the tallest and second tallest in the world and said that we in Chicago are number 3. And we raised it fifth. We said no. Those things have 88 floors. We have 110. Their roofs are at 1,290. Our roof's at 1451. How are they possibly taller? And the council came back and said, we don't count roofs anymore. We now count design features. Your building was designed by Bruce Graham. He designed the building. He did not design the antennas. They do not count towards the height of the building. Therefore, we stop at your roof. Petronas Towers were designed by Cesar Pele, who also designed two totally useless ornamental spires that come off the top of them and top out at 1480, 29 feet above our roof line. So while we had a higher occupiable floor by more than 150 feet and a higher roof line by more than 150 feet, we now had the third tallest building in the world and began sliding. By 2008, we were down to 8th tallest in the world, still with highest floor, highest roof. 2009, Bill Pedersen of the Nuveen building, green glass building, builds a bank building in China, a higher floor, a higher roof, truly taller.
PlayStation 2 building.
Made us number 9. Where do we stand now? 25. Unless you don't count Mass and Spires. Then we're up to 12 again. Now, I mentioned to you earlier about Jeannie Gang's building with the gap in it, which would allow wind to blow through.
I
We
bet
don't
you
have
don't
that
even know
here.
what they're talking about.
That's because Father Khan had a larger building to work with, and he was able to use the traditional methods for dampening the movement of buildings. On a windy day, the building moved. I never knew quite how much it moved until I began doing these cruises. I began meeting people who were working in the building and told me their stories. I had one woman tell me she worked on 100th floor of the building, and she said on windy days, she always tried to avoid being near bookcases. Things were always falling out of them. I had two men tell me their stories. One worked on the 83rd floor, one on the 93rd floor. Their complaints were that on windy days, they had to pre-plan bathroom breaks. There were tidalways in the toilets of the floors where they worked. Go down about 20, 30 stories, they found usable bathrooms. And then one man gave me a summary saying, oh, I worked on 95 for a number of years. Yeah, tidalways and bookcases. Those didn't bother him anywhere near as much as the fact that on a windy day, the building is creaking all day, and the creaking made him crazy. And you may think, okay, scratch that, we're not going to go into a creaking, swaying building.
That's an
You
old
might still
building.
wanna
It's
go.
broken too.
You might be drawn by a feature called the sky deck. It's on the 103rd floor of the building. It's the observation deck. It is the highest observation deck within a building in the Western Hemisphere. It is probably 5th or 6th highest observation deck within a building in the entire world. Your view from up there is 50 miles in any direction on a clear day. Cloudy day with low cloud deck is 2 feet. But that's another story entirely. Now, if you plan to go and visit, heed my warning. Buy a pack of gum before you go in the building. You will go in the building, go down to the second basement. Down there, you will get your tickets for the observation deck. You'll board an elevator. Elevator doors will close in front of you. They will then reopen at the 103rd floor after a non-stop trip with a elapsed time of 61 seconds. That's 1 minute and 1 second from second basement to 103. Why do you want gum? Because your head wants to explode. Keep eating. Chew away. It'll help relieve the pressure. And then you've got your view. And it's a tremendous view. But we're never content with anything in Chicago. And some years back, the owners of the Sky Deck said, hey, let's make it more exciting for people. So they commissioned a new feature called the Ledge. If you look up the left side of the building, you'll see little boxes sticking out of it. That's the Ledge. The Ledge allows you to come to the west side of the building, walk 4 feet outside the original tinted glass walls with railings, to now be surrounded by 3 clear glass walls with no railings. You have a clear glass ceiling over you, and you have the thrill of walking onto a clear glass floor. So you have to override your natural fear of falling 103 stories. But it's easy enough to do. I was up there about a week after they opened up. Tour guides must do this. I stopped dead at the edge and did not go till a 4-year-old ran ahead of me. Then I went out. It was fine. Once you're floating, you're fine. Now, we compete in Chicago for tourist dollars. Our other building with an observation deck is up on North Michigan Avenue, 875 North Michigan. Theirs is the 94th floor, 50-mile view after a 40-second trip. And they said, we got to compete with Willis Tower. We have to have something new in our observation deck. So they commissioned a feature called Tilt. There, for an additional fee, you stake out a section of the south wall. Put your toes to the glass, grab 2 vertical bars, and someone behind you will say, and now you will tilt, and the wall you're holding onto and the floor you're standing on begins moving out of the building. They'll take you out about 15 degrees and pause, and say, and again, and take you to 30 degrees. That's what they do for the public. I was up there about a month after they opened. They had a special evening for those of us in tourism. The attendant said, I'm going to show you full capacity, and took us out 45 degrees. My question was, how often did you clean your glass off? We were way down there. It was quite disconcerting. So we got fun things to do in buildings in Chicago. Now, buildings can be fun as well in terms of what they're doing and showing us. Here to our immediate left-hand side, a building by Lester Knight. The Chicago Post Office, Curtis Collins Postal Station. Wonderful post, our central post office, by the way. Very efficient, highly mechanized. People are able to get in there, do things, work beautifully. That's what's here now since 1999. What we had starting back in 1931 is this next building, the big limestone building, much larger. This building, Art Deco by Graham Anderson Probst and White, 2 blocks long from north to south, 1 block deep from east to west, 12 stories high. It contains 2.7 million square feet of space. In its heyday, it was the busiest post office in the entire world. Now you may go, but why? Chicago was never the largest city in the world. Why would you have the busiest post office? And the answer is very simple. In addition to our citizens, Chicago also had the headquarters for Sears Roebuck and Company, Montgomery Ward and Company, Alden, Spiegel, you name any major catalog sales firm of the 19th and 20th century. They were headquartered in Chicago. All their mail went to the building. And then the postal system said obsolete. Loading docks were in the base of the building. Too much elevator work. Now, a little fun feature about the building. We're passing under the Congress Expressway. 6-lane highway that goes right through the middle of the post office, going east to west. And if that's not enough for you, there are train tracks running north and south under the building. So you got tracks at one level, we got cars at another level, so you got a great deal of activity here. And what's the building being used for now? Office space. Now the fun thing was when it was converted just to offices, developers came in, and anyone who was coming in early on, if they wanted to, create an office floor that was 2 blocks long. A block wide. Your entire company on one floor. And you can see that people who are in here now, Uber Freight. Walgreens has a headquarters here. We have PepsiCo and CBOE, which is Chicago Board of Options Exchange, all of them having huge footprints in the building. The small people have what would be huge in other buildings. So it's a way of keeping it going, and it's very nice retaining the building itself. This next building is kind of an interesting one. Not so much because of the building, but if you look just at eye level, you see no basement, you see trains. This building by Jim DeStefano is what is called an air rights building. Back in the 1950s, the postal system, I should say postal system, the train system was in trouble. We had discovered the joy of flying. We wanted to take planes rather than taking trains. It was faster. And people who were shipping goods had a new interstate highway system to send trucks on, a lot more flexible. So suddenly, railroads were becoming obsolete, and the railroads decided they wanted to dismantle themselves. Government didn't want that. So they told the railroads what they could do is they could start selling or outright or leasing the air over their property for development. You had to stay in action though. So here we have Union Station with columns forming the supports and the foundation for all these buildings. What is owned or rented by the buildings? Street up, the air. The fact they touch the ground is from the railroads. Kind of a fun little box of a building here. Bruce Graham and Fosler Khan. Big open box, no interior columns, no interior walls. The idea was you had this open space as a trading floor. Now the next 2 buildings coming up beyond this next bridge are both by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. They're examples of international style, and I always say they're excellent examples of exactly why international style went out of fashion. A few years after Mies van der Rohe died, there was an American architect named Robert Venturi. Venturi's comment was, Mies always said less is more. My response is less is a bore. I look at these and I agree with him. I hate them. Now, I love Mies van der Rohe buildings. These never worked for me. They bother me. They're Mies. Window panes and window frames. Rectangular forms. What's my problem with them? And finally, it dawned on me it's the windows. Later on, you're going to see the Mies again when we're getting close to the boat. Look at them and you'll notice all his windows are vertical. You look at a Mies wall, your eye is naturally drawn up the building. He's giving us direction. Here, for some strange reason, Skidmore decides to use slightly horizontal windows. Not horizontal enough to create horizontal bands. Those would have been clever. But just horizontal enough to break any verticality. So your eye goes in, goes splat, and goes nowhere. Like I'm thinking to myself, these are by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. They have been giants in their industry since the 1940s. Maybe I also don't understand their buildings. But I got to test my theory a couple years ago. I was doing a charter cruise to the architecture department of Notre Dame University. Boat of architects on board, got them down here, I trashed the buildings. I then posed said, okay, you're the ones training the future architects of America. Are these not badly designed? And after they all had a good laugh, one of them looked at me calmly and said, clearly you never heard the old nickname for Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Back there banging out that kind of building, everyone was calling them three blind Mies. I felt vindicated. This next building is by Halliburton Root. It's a 1929 building. They had a problem. In the 1920s, they did not have technology that allowed them to build over the train tracks. So they built their building back behind the tracks, but nobody wanted the tracks visible. So the walls built by the river, blocking your view, but they were still down there. So girders were run from building to wall, a deck of concrete laid over the girders, covering up the train tracks and creating the first public plaza in the city of Chicago. The detailing on this, you see all these little bob-relief sculptures, is all about printing and writing. The building was built for a newspaper. In fact, the two panels right here by this clock, the left one is the first printing, the right one is the first line of type. So it's all about the printing of newspapers. Our next building, Ralph Johnson, Perkins and Will, builds what I call the tallest train tunnel in the world. It sits smack dab over 6 parallel train tracks. He's got technology to work with. He builds a wall with foundations to the west of the tracks. He builds a wall of foundations on this side, to the east of the tracks. The middle of the building from ground level to street grade is totally empty. 6 train tracks and the occasional passing train. If you're wondering why the name Boeing is on this building, we are looking at what is currently the world headquarters of Boeing aircraft manufacturing. This might confuse you if you know anything about Boeing. They make no planes anywhere near the state of Illinois. Their plants are still in the Pacific Northwest. Headquarters here, but not for long. They announced a couple months ago they're moving their world headquarters to one of the suburbs of Washington, D.C., because most of their contracts are government contracts, so they're going there. They're going to leave a workforce here, and still have the plants in the Pacific Northwest, so getting further away. Now our next building, Technology Triumphs. Jim Getch of Chicago gets a commission. Build a full-size office building on a narrow lot between train track and river. How does he do it? He runs the length of the available property with the core of the building, elevators, stairways, and plumbing. That's the structural core. Gets up around 6 stories, starts projecting out away from that central core, cantilevering offices, coming out about 40, 50 feet. On this side, coming out over the river. On the other side, going out over the train tracks, comes up and spreads out. Now keep one thing in mind. The offices have no foundation under them whatsoever. They depend on the middle of the building. Now, it was completed in 2017. It began winning awards for structural engineering and architectural design in 2015. Once the design was out, the World of Architecture said, they have just solved the impossible site. It's worked beautifully. And there have been other attempts doing this same kind of building, taking on, again, difficult sites. When you want a full-size office building, let's just build it up that way and make things happen a little bit more easily. Now, I mentioned earlier about Picard children. I did not mention that red swirly thing. It's kind of fun. That is a piece of sculpture by Santiago Calatrava. He's an architect and designer from Spain. It's called Constellation. And I have a little theory about that. I think that the owners of the building, when they bought that sculpture, had another thing in mind, not a consolation. In 1871, we had a little event called the Great Chicago Fire. It's a tribute to the fire. They may go, okay, fire, where was it? With the exception of our visit down to Chinatown, almost all of the South Branch was in the zone of the fire. As we are going up here, right now we are about 3 miles south of where the fire ended. It burned for 30 hours from October 8th to October 10th of 1871. Destroyed all of downtown, all the north side. Took down 18,000 buildings. And then we rebuilt after that. Building here to our left, 1898. This is a 124-year-old building. Frank Abbott built a cold storage warehouse building. Originally a windowless wall of brick with lots of insulation and ice blocks. When no longer required, defrosted, insulation pulled out, windows cut in, condo building. And then we've got Harry Weiss, who likes triangles. Here Harry is doing a right angle triangle sitting in it on its side, but he also likes something else. Look at the portholes in front of the building. Look at the spiral staircases, and look at the sloping roof line. Harry said if
That's
he
cool.
build the river, he was going to reference the sea and sailing into the building. He borrows the portholes and spiral staircase from boats, uses the roof line to remind you of sails and masts of ships, creates a totally unique structure. Harry could do unique. Most architects don't have unique in their body. They have creativity. They can adapt things. Here to our left is a complex by the firm of Papa George Hames. They got a commission late 1990s, build a townhouse complex, and they did what every other firm of their era would do. They pulled out a history book and started thumbing through it. When they hit the page on late colonial, early federal architecture, they decided that was what they wanted. They then pitched the idea to the developer, who said, okay, that's fine. So we have these very nice buildings that could be infill in the historical section of Philadelphia. Look at the street lights along the river. Look like gas lights. And if we were to get into the complex, to walk on the sidewalks or drive on the roadways, we'd find ourselves walking or driving on brick pavement. Sort of like a Walt Disney version of colonial America in 21st century Chicago. But then you've got the tower. It's modern and tall. Basic fact, you cannot do tall colonial without looking ridiculous. But the interesting thing is, if you were in the complex, walking around and not looking any higher than the roof line of the townhouses, the base of the tower is the same brick
Look at the mini
and the
house.
same window treatment, both inside and outside. So basically, keep your eyes down. You stay in the 18th
That's a
century,
small
look
house.
up through the 21st.
But it's
Well, let's
really
switch sides
small.
here for the entire parking lot. I'll talk about a warehouse. 1910, George Emmons builds a warehouse for a railway freight company. And of course, you're looking going, but there are balconies, and there are people on one of them, and there are chairs and there are grills. It's not a warehouse anymore. It's not. It's a case of adaptive reuse or repurposing. We had a nasty habit in Chicago well into the 1970s. That habit was the minute any building's original function was no longer required, we knocked it down and built a new building. It was wasteful, it was stupid, we still did it. Lost a lot of buildings that way. But then in the late 1970s, developers began looking at buildings like Nimitz Warehouse or Frank Abbott's and saying, is the building structurally sound? If the answer to that was yes, the next question was, then what else can we do with it? A warehouse can become anything. In both cases, they became residential. But you have to have structural integrity if you want to do adaptive reuse. Here to our right-hand side, there have been warehouses and factories all the way to the edge of the water. This was an industrial neighborhood. They weren't structurally sound. We have one factory left, the brick building with the black water tank. Dates back to about 1910. Everything else gone. Residential towers.
The one
and a
that you
park.
cannot
My
see.
favorite of the towers is this white one right here, right next to the black water tank. The building is called Erie on the Park. It's by the firm of Lucian Lagrange. Notice one thing. That corner is not a right angle. Notice the second thing. Behind that black water tank, there's a little tiny fifth wall. You may wonder, well, what happened here? What happened was, developer buys an oddly shaped parcel of property, realizes that given the shape of the property, Were you to build a traditional rectangular apartment building, you'd end up with a great building by the garage and grass or plaza. Grass and plaza do not generate revenue, they give you maintenance issues. He did not want that, he wanted money. He asked the architects what they could do for him, and their response was, don't hold us to four walls. They gave him a five-sided lopsided crystalline form that fills his property lot line to lot line with structure. Makes him a very happy developer. But you can't always do lot line to lot line. Here to our right, two Art Deco-y apartment buildings by Papa George Hames. Notice they don't come all the way to the water. There's a walkway and there's green between us and them. That's there because of a city mandate. In the mid-'80s, Chicago sat back and said, we have treated the lakefront as public property since the beginning of the century. We will now apply the same principle to the river. If you want to build, you can do that, but you must pull back and provide public access. They will begin applying the same principles to people doing adaptive reuse of old buildings. This is the 1930s Art Deco office building, built for the Montgomery Ward Company. They went bankrupt in 2000. No one needed the office building, it's a sturdy building. So a developer says, I can make it condos. And the city said, if you change the function, you now have to provide access. How are you going to do it? He cuts out part of the basement. That's an arcade into the base of the building. So now you can walk under the building through what was part of the basement to get from Chicago Avenue to the walkway and then to the park. This next was an even earlier Wars building that also had an arcade activity. This one dates back to about 1904. Schmidt, Gard, and Martin created the general warehouse for Wars. And notice one thing here. We're not going vertical here. Everything here is going horizontal. The windows, the brickwork, terracotta, everything horizontal lines all along the building. Not by chance. In the early part of the 20th century, architects working in the Midwest said, we are building on flat land here. We have no wiggle room for any verticality. We're going to do horizontal things. We're going to mimic the flatness of the prairies. And eventually their style of architecture became known as the Prairie School. Well, the building, no longer required by wards, part of it turns into office space. The other side turns into residential, and of course, the arcade is cut in. And the building, now 118 years old, continues to thrive. Now I keep thinking about the fact, I'd like to think about it as being used by wards. Imagine, if you will, being an order filler for wards. The goods of your company are stored in a 2-block-long warehouse. And as late as the 1970s, you are challenged by the fact that you have no technology supporting you. Fax and email have not been invented yet. Photocopying exists. Expensive, you don't photocopy things. So how do the order fillers do their job quickly and efficiently? In the board's warehouse. When they arrived at work in the morning, they went into their cloakrooms. They took off their coats, slipped off their shoes, laced on a pair of roller skates, skated out to get a stack of oars and a wheel card, and then spent the entire day roller skating through the building, filling orders. I'd always heard the story, and I kept thinking to myself it was an urban myth, which is basically there was a lie. But everyone told the story, so I would always tell it, but I would always tell it saying, legend has it, because I really wasn't sure about it. And then 12 years ago, I finished a cruise. I'm now at the base of the ramp saying goodbye to my guests as they're leaving. Elderly woman comes walking off the boat. The man with her walks up to me and he says, Mother wants to talk to you. This is normally a very bad start for a conversation for a tour guide. Mother's going to give you a correction to what you were saying. You know that. So I braced, walked up to her, asked her how I could help her, and she looked at me and she said, today is my 90th birthday and you gave me a gift. You talked about my history. I was one of those skaters. And then she gave him a look you never want from your mother any day of the year, and she said, and now he has to believe me. So I proved Mother had not lost it. Now you may think, okay, it's nice to save old buildings. They're pretty. But why would I want to live in one of them? I'm going to show you why you might be interested. At least some of you. Because we come out under the bridge here, look to the left, pick any balcony and look at the door. Do the doors look short to you? Those are not short doors, they're standard sized doors. If they look short, the reason is you are looking at a building in which each unit has 17-foot ceilings. Us tall folk don't like modern buildings. Nowadays, ceiling height's about 9 feet 6, 10 feet maybe. Luxury 12. This is 17. It's wonderful. Way amount of space over your head. Now, before I lose a chance, swing over here to your right-hand side, bask in the glory of this building. We're going past the printing and distribution plant of the Chicago Tribune, designed by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill back in the 1970s, with all the basic charms of a maximum security prison. Ironically, the building is known as the Freedom Center. Now you look at it and you go, okay, pretty much solid brick wall, a couple of windows, louver-gridded, no light in, no light out. What's going on here? They're ignoring the river. Everybody else is enjoying it with parks and walkways and balconies. What's with the Tribune with this anti-river attitude? And the answer is the timing of this building. When the Freedom Center was under construction, the river was a very different body of water. It was an industrial body of water. I've been mentioning factories, warehouse, and office buildings. Those were the benign uses of the river. Now I can go into some other ones. Steel mills, leather tanneries, and for more than a century, down south of Ping Tom Park, there was an operation known as Union Stockyards. That was the largest meatpacking operation ever in the history of the world. And for a very long time, the basic belief was that if you had riverfront property and there was something in your building or on your property that bothered you, just sweep it off into the river to wash away after a while. There's a problem with that theory. You keep sweeping, it stops washing. And sure enough, the pollution level of the river kept increasing. For decades, every time the EPA did water quality tests, they would come back with the Chicago River is a toxic body of water. Had they wanted to be more thorough and complete, they could have tacked on a second word, which would have been flammable. Portions of the river had enough pollutants you could light it. And it was not a nice thing. Now, I'm a very proud Chicagoan. I'll very happily tell you, the river we are floating on is no longer toxic or flammable. Now it's only highly polluted. May not sound exciting, but it's a major change. In our toxic days, had you decided at the end of the cruise to try to ask one of those trick questions and say, Al, how many fish live in the river? I could have given you a very honest, direct answer. None. The river was dead. We have no fish. Nowadays, same question. My answer will change every year or so. Now I will talk species of fish. And the last count I heard at one point was 60. So lots of fish living and thriving in the river. And a couple of years back, after a whole lot of testing, the Food and Drug Administration declared that any fish caught in the river is actually edible. That one many still find very doubtful, but that's what they say. Now, I will point out, the river is still a highly polluted body of water, which in my mind means unless you want an infection, you don't go swimming in it. But about 6 years ago, members of our county board and also of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District went swimming in the South Branch down by Ping Tom Park to preview the swim in the water. I kept waiting to see who would die of what disease first. They all survived, so I was obviously being overly pessimistic. And they've gone back every year to prove you can swim in the river. I still don't recommend it. But things are moving along. But changes take place. For instance, Kinsey Park here to our right. Imagine wanting to have a townhouse facing a river that smelled and might be burning. That wouldn't have happened. This shows you the river had been changing even as late as far back as the 1990s. Here to our left, East Bank Club. It had no windows originally. It was built in the 70s when the river was still disgusting. Well, Kinsey Park came in, river improved. Let's cut in windows, paint the concrete, throw in ivy and plants. We're now a wonderful place to come enjoy. So people have this that we enjoy. Now, buildings can change as their function changes. And a good example is ahead of us on the left-hand side, Holiday Inn building. Upper floors, Holiday Inn Hotel, Holiday Inn Mart Plaza. 8 levels of guest rooms, lots of windows. The building was originally built as the Apparel Mart of Chicago, and the bottom 12 stories were occupied by dealers in fine fabric. Fabric dealers hate sunlight more than vampires do. It causes fading of material. They did not want to lose money. They wanted no windows. The building was built 12 windowless floors of concrete. Hotel was sometimes referred to as the hotel with the tallest basement in the world. Well, when the Apparel Mart moved out, people moved in. Office workers wanted to have windows, and sure enough, they began cutting in windows. It took them more than 2 years. But they opened up the walls, and people got views. At least people, in some cases, got views for a while. Unfortunately, for some of them, they're facing south, and not that many years ago, the owners of this property decided to start building. We have a very nice apartment building by BKO. This is, I believe, a rental building. Very nice, very lovely sitting here. Unfortunately, blocking about a third of the people in the Apparel Mart from seeing anything. As we go past the BKL building, you're going to see a new building, still under construction. This should be opening up next year. It's a Salesforce Tower building. Be a 65-story office building, and it is obviously blocking more of the view. So things do change, and we're losing part of the people heading downstairs. All of a sudden, the rain just starts up again. I like when we first turned and we suddenly had the rain stop. Now we're heading back onto the main stem of the river. And we'll be talking, you'll be able to hear it downstairs. And sort of hang out towards the left-hand side. That's the stuff we'll be talking. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the one coming up on our left right now. The Mart, otherwise known as the Merchandise Mart of Chicago. Completed in 1931. The building is by the architecture firm of Graham Anderson Bromston White. And Graham Anderson Bromston White was trying to create an Art Deco building. I'm saying trying to create an Art Deco building. Deco is a very vertical style. The Mart is a very horizontal building. 2.5 blocks long, a block and a half deep, 18 stories high, basically about 4 million square feet of space. When it opened up, everyone kept saying the Merchandise Mart was a failure as a building. I always say one thing, it's not a failure as a building. It may not be the best Art Deco design in the world, but when it opened up, it was a world record holder. We're looking at what was in 1931 the largest building in the world. It held the title from 1931 until 1943. In 1943, it was passed by the Senate, which got a whole lot of leverage to be larger than this one. But this one is still, at the age of 91, amongst the handful of largest non-government buildings in the world. And it's this huge building sitting right here on the river. Next building coming up here on our left-hand side, little brick building with some other features on it. It was built for the Chase and Sanborn Coffee Company. It's another one of the old shipping buildings that we got here. They have warehouse space at the bottom. They have office space up top. And there is a legend about the building that on a humid day you go in and you still smell coffee. There's been so much stored in there over the years. It's very much communicated from the building. The last building to the right of it dates in 2009 by Pickard Chilton. If you look at the corners of the towers, you look right through them. No structural columns. There are no structural columns or walls whatsoever. It's a central core structure, and then the floors are built out to the big open glass wall. Our next building, 1914. George Nimitz builds this building for the Freed Murdoch Company. Freed Murdoch for the wholesale grocery business. Lower floors occupied by produce. That was where their warehouse spaces were. Upper floors, office space. And you may notice the clock up there, kind of something with a clock. That is actually a conference room with 4 functioning clock faces on the outside. So you can sit there and be surrounded by all the time what you need. You definitely know what time your conference is running. And the one coming up on Yeah.
Oh.
I didn't know all the features. There's so many things to choose from. And actually, that's
la cosa también.
if you look just to the left of the tower, you see it's vertical.
Yo se lo agarro.
That's the House of Blues. And the building it's sitting in was originally built to be a movie studio, a movie
Thank you.
theater, and a television studio. Behind it